Now, it's a great honor to introduce Don Asci. Don was a wonderful student at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, from which he graduated in 1993 with a master's degree. And then he went on to the University of Santa Croce in Rome, which is run by Opus Dei, and he received his licentiate in sacred theology and systematic theology, and his doctorate in sacred theology and moral theology from the Università del Santa Croce in Rome. His dissertation director for his doctorate was a good friend of mine, Robert Gall, and since then he's been teaching here. He's been teaching, even before that, he was teaching at the Franciscan University in Steubenville, coming here. He's the author of his dissertation, I think, was on the Conjugal Act, his personal act. It was published by Ignatius Press and is an excellent book. And his wife is here, Michelle. And I must say this, that when they were in Washington, she worked in the library at the Dominican House of Studies where we were housed. And at that time, we were praying that she would become pregnant. She was having some difficulty in getting pregnant. Well, God works wonders, because after they'd been married for 7 years, she got pregnant, and by golly, they now have 5 children. So that's good. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. May, especially for saying that I was a fine student. If I may borrow a theme from yesterday between the professor-student relationship, I'm reminded by Dr. May's presence here in Gaming of a time in which he very passionately and loudly corrected me down 3 corridors of the Dominican House of Studies. And the funny part actually is I think I only asked a question, but it was I felt honored to be worthy of correction. So the title of my paper is Chastity Refined: The Finality of Sex and the Value of the Person. Today I think I'll just give a lecture based on the paper rather than the paper itself. It's more in keeping with my style, and I think also in keeping with the time limits we have and the time of day which we are. The point of departure for my paper is the question raised by Dr. Wallstein yesterday. What is the context of theology of the body? This is what I thought of first. In what context should we read Pope John Paul II's theology of the body? What will help us understand the relevance of the teaching? And really then, what can we expect of the teaching? And I think, first of all, I want to say that to me, it's a testament to the greatness of Pope John Paul II that already at this conference, we've been able to answer that question in so many diverse ways with our diverse backgrounds. That we can say, well, look, he's using St. John of the Cross to defend us against the dangers of modern philosophy. Oh no, he's using Shaler to discover the human dimensions of the spousal relationship. He's using Vatican Council II. He's providing a vision of femininity. I think this is a testament to his greatness. Probably he's doing it all, right? That would be like him to do it all at once. For my answer to the question, I would say that I approach the text as a moral theologian. And as a moral theologian, I read theology of the body as a vision of conjugal chastity, and in particular, a refined vision of chastity. And I think this refined vision of chastity is really a primary hermeneutical key and also a primary result of the catechesis. And this seems especially true from the perspective of contemporary moral theology. It's difficult not to read theology of the body as a decisive response to revisionist movements in Catholic moral theology, because it is so well used as such a response. It presents itself so well as such a response. And this seems particularly true as well if we look at the historical context, what's going on in the late 1970s. If we look at it in this way, also we can further see that the theology of the body takes up already some of the work of his pre-papal writings. He's already responding to this movement as a philosopher. This also puts the catechesis in line with the other papal teachings of the 20th century that had already dealt with this revisionist movement. And it's especially then also going to fit in with the rest of the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, especially Veritatis Splendor. And if I could just briefly add that you could add that to your list as well, Dr. Wallstein, of something to have handy when you read theology of the body, that Veritatis Splendor seems to be of the same line of thought. Of course, to accept chastity as the key that unlocks the whole, one must have a substantial notion of chastity. First, it's important to see that chastity is not just the ethical dimension of theology of the body. Pope John Paul II unfolds the theology of the body across what he calls It's across what he calls the anthropological, ethical, and sacramental dimensions of the relationship of man and woman. And just like sexuality itself, chastity runs throughout these dimensions. Second, it's important to see chastity as the key to the whole. It's important to recognize that John Paul II in Theology of the Body does not present the vision of chastity fully directly. Rather, he provides a profound analysis of the two fundamental reference points of every concept of chastity, namely human sexuality and concupiscence. Any adequate understanding of chastity sees chastity as the faithful living of sexuality on the one hand, and as the avoidance or overcoming of concupiscence on the other hand. And when we look at it in this way, we see that each part of the catechesis clearly contributes to a better understanding of these two fundamental reference points. And with this idea, then, there's nothing in the catechesis that stands outside of this theme of chastity, because each of them is somehow each part of the catechesis is somehow going to speak about human sexuality itself or the overcoming of concupiscence. In a way, then, I would invite you to read the text such that you see chastity throughout in this way. That when he's speaking of sexuality according to God's design, you say, that's what chastity is. When he speaks of the effects of concupiscence, you say, chastity then is the converse. But I think in that way you can see chastity throughout. The next point in seeing chastity as this key to unlocking the whole, it's necessary also to have a broad meaning of chastity, or a broad expectation of what chastity might mean. While chastity in Theology of the Body remains a virtue in the traditional sense of the word, chastity for Theology of the Body is not merely a disposition to good behavior, as we have in the classical definition of virtue. Instead, chastity, according to Theology of the Body, consists of an integration of the person, or a disposition to this integration of the person, experiences of this integration, and then experiences which lead to good behavior as a living of these experiences. If you see chastity in these three dimensions, I think you see how Theology of the Body provides a full sense of what it means to be chaste without displacing the proper notion of chastity as a disposition to good behavior. In Theology of the Body, chastity remains such a disposition, but now it's rooted in something more fundamental, namely this integration of the person and these experiences. To think about that a little bit further, mention some points on the 20th century context of the teaching and a movement within 20th century Catholic moral theology that we can call revisionist, which was in a way, and is ongoing, as a way of rejecting traditional Catholic moral teaching. In traditional Catholic teaching on sexuality and marriage, chastity consists of a firm disposition whereby sexual passions are governed or directed to activity that realizes the natural ends or purposes of human sexuality. These ends are known by reason, and it's according to these ends that the human conscience judges what is good with regard to sexual acts. In this way, chaste acts are chosen for the sake of these natural ends, and unchaste acts cannot or do not realize these ends. Since reason, moreover, recognizes that these ends are procreation and union, and that these ends can be realized only in the conjugal act, the chaste person judges that the only complete sexual act that meets the criteria of goodness is the conjugal act. Therefore, the sexual passion must be directed to this conjugal act alone. The most important thing, though, is that the hallmark of this traditional approach rests in having the natural ends of sexuality as the primary reference point for chastity. Again, the chaste acts realize those natural ends, and the unchaste acts do not. But it's important to note, this is not the rigorous interpretation of the sexual urge mentioned in Love and Responsibility, pointed out by Dr. Colosi yesterday. Precisely, it is not this rigorous vision, precisely because in the traditional understanding, traditional Catholic understanding, the chaste person acts for the sake of these ends, wills these ends, and is not in any way a means to the ends, but adopts these ends himself. I would just point you to Love and Responsibility, pages 59 and 60, where Wojtyła makes this point, that God does not use us as a means to these ends because we choose them ourselves. And there Wojtyła says, in choosing these ends, we have the possibility for love. So we'll come back to that in due time. In Love and Responsibility, Wojtyła notes that some, he says, some, maybe the same some that he mentions in Veritatis Splendor, but you could think about that, but he notes, some object to this line of thought, this traditional Catholic teaching, under the claim that it subordinates the person to nature in a way that is contrary to human subjectivity and human dignity. Many of those then who object to this traditional teaching on sex, marriage, and chastity, in turn offer what we can call a revisionist presentation of sex, marriage, and chastity. I use the word revisionist there in a blanket way. Other authors call the revisionists crypto-dualist, pseudo-personalist, spiritualistic personalist. They go by many names perhaps, but the trend is always the same. This revisionist presentation of sex, marriage, and chastity is characterized in the first place by this effort to deny the normative significance of natural structures and natural finalities. In an effort, they say, to free the person to a perceived subordination to nature. That's the first hallmark of the revisionist move. Moreover, the revisionists propose to affirm the intrinsic value of the person by segregating the personal order from the natural order, which they normally think of primarily in terms of biology, which is a mistake in itself. Going further, the revisionists describe the marital relationship as love in the form of a communion of persons through self-donation, a communion which is sought in itself and for its own sake through the personal subjectivity of man and woman. Unwilling then to subordinate the marital relationship to anything extrinsic to the persons, the revisionists relegate the natural finality of sexuality to mere consequences of the communion that is sought. Specifically, the revisionists reject the description of marriage in terms of a hierarchical structure with the ends, a hierarchical structure of ends with procreation as the primary end. And they even suggest that an emphasis on procreation can turn the spouses away from attention on each other. Naturally, revisionists grant that new life may come from this communion that is sought, but in the words of Pope Pius XII, in describing this movement, he says, for them procreation remains outside or on the borders of the values of the person. So it may come from the communion, but only the communion is properly a personal value for these revisionists. A further move that we often see in the revisionists is an attempt to set the meaning of marriage against the ends of marriage. There is a distinction then in the revisionist movement between meaning and end, as if they are speaking of two different categories or two lines of development within the marital relationship. The result is simply that man and woman in marriage may seek the meaning of the relationship without necessarily acting for the sake of its ends. And again, referring to Pope Pius XII, he calls this a serious inversion of the orders, a serious inversion of the order of the values of the marital life. One more note on the revisionists. The revisionists anticipate that this notion of the marital relationship would result from an approach to sexuality from the perspective of personal subjectivity. Conversely, they argue that describing marriage in terms of its natural finality represents a kind of failure to escape a classical or static or cosmological worldview, a worldview that they find simply invalid in the modern world. So the traditional teaching has become invalid in the modern world precisely because of the worldview on which it's based. Finally, the point of this revisionist movement for our discussion today is that the resulting concept of chastity locates the goodness of sexual acts in the loving communion of man and woman achieved through sexual self-donation. Thus, a communion itself replaces the natural ends as the fundamental reference point in their concept of chastity. Chaste acts foster communion through self-donation, and unchaste acts hinder communion through mutual use. On the surface, the revisionist approach seems to free man from the need to act for the sake of the natural ends and purposes, but ultimately the revisionist attempt to promote the value of the person fragments the person by dividing him into two orders, personal and natural, and most seriously, I think, by narrowing and reducing its appreciation of human sexuality. And though the revisionists, many of them started in a well-meaning way in the early 20th century, we can see the consequences of the movement later, and especially by the time of Humanae Vitae, that the full appreciation of sexuality is no longer present to the point of even simply and directly excluding the procreative good. If we turn our to Pope John Paul II, I think it's in this context that we ought to view his work, that he sees that tension between the revisionist and the tradition, and he wants, in a way, to resolve that tension. And he begins this, as I said, already as a philosopher. We see this especially in Love and Responsibility, but also some of his other pre-papal essays. When we think about Pope John Paul II in the context of this tension between the tradition and the revisionist, I think it's important to see that operating first with an integral vision of man, a more developed notion of love, and a proper concept of procreation, Pope John Paul II succeeds precisely where the revisionists have failed. That is, he gives us an understanding that man and woman are not subordinated to nature, yet he doesn't fall into any of the traps of the revisionists precisely because of the vision of man he has, the concept of love he has, and the concept of procreation that he's operating with. When we look first at Love and Responsibility, then, Pope John Paul II adopts the perspective of personal subjectivity. He has this similarity with the revisionist. But he does so in a way that confirms the integration of the personal and natural order, rather than dividing them. Secondly, Pope John Paul II, also keen to affirm the intrinsic value of the person, but he sees that intrinsic value affirmed precisely in a loving communion realized on the basis of a common good. And again, this seems to be the decisive move for him. Here I think I'm differing a little bit with the presentation of Professor Seifert this morning. I didn't have time to ask a question about this, but we could note that the importance of common good was not stressed this morning. For me, it seems to be the key to reading Love and Responsibility, so we may have to discuss that at some point. But it's certainly a key for my thesis, so I hope it works out. Going back to that idea then, Pope John Paul II sees the intrinsic value of the person affirmed in a loving communion, but one that is realized on the basis of common goods. He also sees that you have love as a communion wherein man and woman subordinate themselves to each other for the sake of the common good, and to the common good for the sake of each other. And this is a decisive move because it's precisely here that the natural finalities of sexuality come into his thought. You have the natural finality of sexuality as the ends of procreation and union entering precisely as the common good upon which this communion will be realized. Therefore, he resolves any notion of a tension between the communion and these goods, this procreation and this union. The communion is realized on the basis of what these are. In this sense, then, procreation is not a mere consequence of the communion, but again, at the very basis of the communion. If we follow the line of thought, he's simply saying, if the intrinsic value of the person is affirmed in love, and love requires a common good, the intrinsic value of the person is affirmed with a willingness to have procreation as the common good of the relationship. I would just point you in Love and Responsibility, pages 222 and 236, where he no less than 14 times states this, that personal union will be realized only with a conscious awareness of becoming mother and father. And he states its converse many times as well, that an unwillingness deprives the relationship of union. Again, the main point is that there is no dichotomy or tension between the goods that sexuality presents to man and woman by its very nature. They take those goods up as the common good of their relationship, and this serves communion rather than hindering it. Again, the other part of the story, as I mentioned, is that he's operating with a different understanding of procreation. If we think about that just briefly, John Paul II, in Love and Responsibility, already is able to avoid a situation where procreation detracts from the person with whom one is having communion, precisely because, first of all, he sees procreation as the good of the other. So what you're willing is a good of the other is naturally brought into the picture. Moreover, it is a good internal to the other because he speaks of motherhood and fatherhood through this procreation. And it is something shared with the other. So across all three of those points, the other is entirely present in his concept of procreation. Again, the net result in terms of the vision of chastity is that chastity for John Paul II will be found in acting for the sake of procreation and union as the basis of personal communion. The reference point for chastity now becomes communion through or on the basis of procreation and union. Again, it's not just a blend of the first two, traditional and revisionist, but in a way it succeeds where the others might fail. It is almost like a blend. If we move on then to the theology of the body, I think it's important again to read it in this context. As a moral theologian, this is how I would invite you to see it. Is that Pope John Paul II, in developing this line of thought, is able to avoid any false tension between the natural finality of sexuality, the natural ends of sexuality, and the value of the person, precisely by focusing on the place where they most obviously meet, namely the body. And this is how I read his turn to the body and his development of the theology of the body as the meeting place of this value of the person and the ends of sexuality itself. Having given that introduction, what I want to do next is outline the vision of chastity in theology of the body. And again, I'm suggesting that you can read the whole catechesis under this theme, that is throughout the catechesis. Not proceeding chronologically or systematically, though, through the catechesis, but simply thematically. But it's across the whole breadth of the catechesis. I think you can view the vision of chastity in theology of the body in terms of 4 pillars upon which chastity rests, and then 3 manifestations of those pillars. The first pillar, the chaste person experiences the spousal meaning of the body. What this means is that the chaste person, first of all, recognizes the human identity of the body and a consequent personal dignity of the body. The chaste person experiences the body as a constitutive part of the person, Pope John Paul II says, as a concrete manifestation of the person. In sum, the chaste person experiences the body as someone made concretely present, and a unique self then present in this body. Under this first pillar, this experience of the spousal meaning of the body, the chaste person also experiences what Pope John Paul II calls the somatic homogeneity of man and woman, that is, the sameness of the body of man and woman. In this perception of the somatic homogeneity of the body, the chaste person also experiences the other-directedness of the body, that is the way in which sexuality already has a reference to another in it, experiences that other-directedness as an ordination to self-gift and communion. And as we've already discussed in various ways, the idea here is that the body is experienced by the chaste person as signaling an ordination to a spousal relationship in which the person exists both for his own sake, as we've already said, and is realized through a gift. And this is where the spousal meaning comes in. Still under this first pillar, the chaste person, in experiencing the spousal meaning of the body, further experiences the body as what Pope John Paul II calls the substratum of the personal communion of man and woman. That is, the chaste person experiences the body not just as a sign that communion is meant to be between man and woman, but really as the place or the opportunity for that communion. Here, the chaste person sees how masculinity and femininity allow for communion by allowing for a certain choice. And the chaste person perceives then sexual complementarity as a value in itself, as leading to communion in this way. In experiencing the spousal meaning of the body, the chaste person also experiences what we call the sacramentality of the body. That is, the chaste person recognizes how the ordination to gift and communion in the body is a sign and a reflection of the love of the Creator. And again, very simply here, the idea is that the chaste person experiences how man and woman being created as gifts for each other are gifts from the Creator. That is, the Creator is a gift giver and thereby a lover. And this is the basic meaning of the sacramentality of the body. Further, under this experience of the spousal meaning of the body, the chaste person also experiences what Pope John Paul II calls its generative, or I prefer procreative meaning of the body. If you look in the translation that Dr. Wallstein has made, this is accurately translated generative meaning of the body, but throughout the rest of the text, the Pope speaks of procreation and not generation. So I'm going to, in a way, retranslate it there. But it's the procreative meaning of the body that is included in this experience of the spousal meaning of the body. Simply, he says that the man and woman experience, this is the chaste man and woman experience how masculinity and femininity contain the mystery of motherhood and fatherhood, and how motherhood and fatherhood further reveal the mystery of masculinity and femininity. And again, the body plays a role in this by showing how this choice can take place in and through the sexuality of the body. They can become mother and father together precisely through their bodies. All of this first pillar, experiencing the spousal meaning of the body, means for Pope John Paul II seeing the body with the inner gaze, as he puts it. That is, seeing the body in such a way that allows for the fullness of intimacy on the basis of a full appreciation of what the body can be and what the body leads to in terms of communion. Finally, it's important to note that this first pillar is based again on having an experience of the spousal meaning of the body. And the relevance here is it's not just a matter of knowing that the body should be understood in terms of these truths, but having these truths enter into what we call a lived experience yesterday. And here you can see some of the phenomenological method operative. But having these truths of the body enter through lived experience into the inner life of the person, such that now these truths of the body in a way determine or affect the attitude and activity of the person. The main point of this first pillar, though, is that the chaste person takes a stance towards the body, whereby the body is lived as someone, not something, and moreover someone ordered to gift and self-gift and communion. The next pillar of chastity that I see in the theology of the body, the chaste person experiences inner freedom. Inner freedom in its most fundamental element is an experience of self-movement, self-governance, and self-determination rooted in the powers of reason and will. That is an experience of freedom itself and how freedom underlies our activity. But in the context of chastity, inner freedom takes the form of self-mastery and self-possession that allow for self-gift according to the spousal meaning of the body. In this sense, inner freedom means a genuine self-movement, self-governance, and self-determination in and through a mastery or dominion over the passions, such that sexual activity maintains its proper human character. John Paul II further describes this as a certain control over the heart that ultimately liberates the heart. Under the second pillar, though, of inner freedom, the most important point is that the chaste person, through inner freedom, experiences an integration of flesh and spirit, or experiences the somatic and spiritual unity of their self. Inner freedom gives the person the ability to rule over the body, as it were, rule over the passions related to the body with a simplicity and naturalness that is not ruling over them as though they were something else, but precisely as oneself. As a critical part of chastity, this experience of inner freedom entails passions and desires pertaining to the body that are in uniformity with the judgment or voice of conscience. That is, we have desires in inner freedom that are confirmed as good by the judgment of conscience. And there you have an experience of that unity of the spirit and the flesh, that what is felt in the flesh is judged by the spirit or in the conscience as good. From that, inner freedom allows the chaste person to have great desires and to even give himself over to these desires, precisely because the movement of his sexual passion is now trustworthy. It's been judged or is continually judged as good. He can commit himself in a way that is in a trusting way to these passions. Mastery over the passions then does not mean a lessening of passion or a kind of rejection of passion. It is rather an orientation of desire to that which is good, and a consequent being free from suspicion of these desires. There is then a kind of peace between the passions and the conscience. Essentially, in this line, Pope John Paul II says, in inner freedom, the sexual passions move in response to what is true, good, and beautiful, and that which is known in the judgment of conscience. In this inner freedom, the chaste person becomes sensitive to the broad scales of values in sexuality. And what Pope John Paul II means here is that by mastering passions that would narrow one's view of sexuality to that which is sensually gratifying, inner freedom opens the person to the fullness of what is true, good, and beautiful in sexuality. Moreover, with inner freedom, there is a proper discernment on the part of the person in the relationship between the goods of sexuality themselves, what's good, true, and beautiful in sexuality, and the intrinsic value of the person. Again, there's no tension or competition between the two in inner freedom. Freedom in this sense then allows man and woman to experience sexual attraction precisely as a call to communion, and it results in a chaste relationship whereby man and woman are able to belong to each other without appropriation. That is, man and woman don't say so much to each other, you are mine, but I am yours, to the point that really I am you. A communion is realized where these identities are brought together. From inner freedom, Pope John Paul II says we get a reverence for sexuality, and in turn we perceive, love, and practice the meanings of the language of the body with spontaneity rather than constraint. Above all, you have in inner freedom the avoidance of reduction in your appreciation of sexuality. This is the main point, that it opens the person to the whole scale of values, to all that is true, good, and beautiful in sexuality, gives you the ability, freedom to wonder about the whole sexuality of the other and even of one's own sexuality. The third pillar of chastity in Theology of the Body: the chaste person engages in sexual activity for the sake of procreation and union. Here, deeply rooted in the first two pillars, the experience of the spousal meaning of the body, the experience of inner freedom, we have now a perception of value transformed or translated in this third pillar into a disposition to good activity. You have in this third pillar of chastity a disposition to act for the sake of the goods of sexuality that have previously been perceived in the first two experiences or in the first two pillars. This third pillar is somewhat of a stumbling block for some. We don't have so much time to give it perhaps a full analysis. If I can then try to concisely make the point. The chaste person, what we're saying with this third pillar is that the chaste person desires sexual activity precisely as a participation in the goods of procreation and union. Sees these as goods of sexuality and what the activity ought to lead to, why it would be good or why it would be desirable. Again, since only the conjugal act allows for the realization of these goods, the participation in these goods, the chaste person would only choose the conjugal act is the only complete sexual act that the chaste person would choose, I should say. All other physical expressions, if they are good, are somehow subordinated to this one act. It stands in a category all its own for the chaste person, because it alone allows for the participation in these goods. To accept the full significance of this third pillar, it's certainly necessary to have a good understanding, to say the least, of the terminology involved, and that's what we don't have so much time to do. I spent 300 pages of my book trying to unfold the terminology. I won't do that here, although I'm tempted to, because I think it makes a lot of sense. But briefly then, I would just say that if you want to understand this third pillar, that the chaste person engages in sex for the sake of procreation and union, it's important to see first that we speak of the conjugal act, which is a moral species. Again, now I'm reverting to a moral theologian. As I said, that's how I come to the text. The conjugal act is a moral species. That is, it's something willed. It's not a material event. And again, here's where you need your veritatis splendor. But when we speak of a moral species in this way, or the conjugal act as a moral species, we're saying it refers to an object of choice. That is a freely chosen kind of behavior that gets its name, gets its meaning for the person ultimately, from the per se effect of the behavior. This per se effect, again, looking at love and response, looking at veritatis splendor, is going to be the proximate end of the will of the person. That is, to make a choice of the conjugal act is to make a choice for a behavior that has some effects that now become the proximate end of the will. That's as concisely as I can put it. Next, then, you need to understand the terms procreation and union, which is far more complicated to explain. But it's enough to note that in the magisterial teachings, procreation is understood in two senses, the active sense and the passive sense. In the passive sense, procreation refers to the conception of children itself, those who receive life. But in the active sense, it refers to the activity of the couple. And already in Love and Responsibility, John Paul II is utilizing this distinction, I think, very clearly. He mentions it in some of his essays, but it's really the key to solving some of the dilemmas here. Procreation in its active dimension, then, is what we want to concentrate on. Understood as the activity of the couple, it is the participation in the genesis of a person by a cooperation with God and nature, whereby man and woman unleash with foresight the natural forces that lead to conception and provide the proper and just context for God's creation of a soul. And this was well brought out by Professor Seifert this morning, that procreation really has to be seen in light of this, creating a context for God's creative power. What we're saying then is that procreation in its active sense consists of what man and woman do to become mother and father in full justice. What man and woman do to provide for the proper context of God's creative act, whereby he brings the soul and the child into existence. It does mean loving the child into existence by willing motherhood and fatherhood for each other, but also making sure that the act itself is what man and woman do to become mother and father in accord with justice. The point then is that choosing to procreate does not mean choosing to conceive. And these are two distinct ideas, two distinct terms that we want to operate with. It does mean, though, choosing to procreate, that man and woman choose to do what? Man and woman do to become mother and father, precisely because they want motherhood and fatherhood for each other. This choice is what is unitive, precisely because this activity involves a form of co-subjectivity, a form of coming together that really is inseparable from this willing of motherhood and fatherhood for each other. Moving on from that, I think that could be an important point of discussion, but moving on from that, the important point of this third pillar is also that by having procreation as the ends of the chaste activity, procreation and union as the ends of the chaste activity, this puts pleasure in its proper place. It is an accompaniment to the participation in these goods. So now, again, what we're saying is that the chaste person desires an activity that will allow him to participate in these goods. He accepts and wills the pleasure as an accompaniment to those goods, but pleasure is not his goal. And again, this highlights the uniqueness of genital intercourse. Whereas pleasure might be had in many other physical behaviors, of sexual acts, procreation and union are only in the conjugal act. And there's a kind of narrowing then of the focus of the chaste person. This would in turn, if we thought about it further, bring in marriage as well, but we leave that out for now. Moving on then to the fourth pillar of chastity in theology of the body. The fourth pillar is that the chaste person speaks truthfully in sexual activity. And here is one of the more famous elements of the catechesis, that there is a language of the body that is operative in the man-woman relationship. In this sense, what we want to think about is that in sexual relations, the body speaks on behalf of the person through a language of the body, as Pope John Paul II says. The chaste person then speaks truthfully in this language. We understand this language of the body to be a symbolic language. That is, it's based in the very bodily structure of the act. We don't have to put the meaning or the message into the body to have this language. It's there in itself. Rather, we discover this language of the body. We discover the meanings of the language of the body. And then, having read this language properly, we are able to act truthfully or according to it. It's important to see that in sexual relations, it's not normal that a person would decide to be deceitful or truthful. Right? This is not what we're saying. It is more the case that a person decides on an activity that either conforms to the truth of the message of this language of the body or does not. And in this way, it's more important to see that the message of the body is normative for the choice that's going to take place in the sexual act. The message itself, I think, can be summarized in this way. I want to do with you what man and woman do to become mother and father, because I want others like you to exist. I want to participate in the creation of others like you, because I want the good in you to be continued and preserved in others like you. Ultimately, then, I radically give myself to you for the whole of my life. This is the message of the body that we have then as the norm that we have to try and live up to. We have to mean this. We have to make choices that fulfill this meaning. Pope John Paul II doesn't mention this, but I think it is worth mentioning briefly. I suspect, and what we know from experience, and especially marriage counseling, that although there is one language of the body, I think there are two dialects. That is, man is operating with one language, or one dialect, sorry, and the woman is operating with another dialect. And on a practical level, I think this is important, that the chaste person knows not only his own dialect, but the dialect of the other. And there is a sensitivity to that in chastity. That's what I'm suggesting, that the chaste person perceives this difference. That what I want to say to the other, I may have to say according to how the other will understand, and not just assume the other communicates in the body the way I do. Beyond those four pillars of chastity, I think you have in Theology of the Body three manifestations of chastity, which would be then the manifestations of the coming together of these four pillars. So they're not something different. It's not three other things. It's these four when they all come together. They meet to produce these three things. The three manifestations then are, first, the chaste person is able to be naked without shame. Chastity manifests itself in this capacity to be naked without shame. Here again, we talked about this briefly in some of the other discussions, but shame represents a specific difficulty identifying with the human body, according to Pope John Paul II. It is also, that is, shame is also a consequent fear or anxiety that the sexual values of the body may obscure the intrinsic value of the person. It is then also consequently a tendency to guard against such treatment. And again, although men and women tend to feel shame differently, they are both susceptible to it, according to Pope John Paul II, in their own way, in the sexual relationship. While in its essence, shame hinders the sexual relationship of man and woman, it can serve the relationship in a positive way insofar as it promotes the dignity of man and woman through that tendency to guard oneself. But if we look at shame, again, in terms of the four pillars that I've outlined, shame signals, in the first place, an absence of the first two pillars. It's an absence of the experience of the spousal meaning of the body. It is an absence of inner freedom. And it is then a consequent fear of missing the second two pillars. It is a fear of not having a good sexual act, one in which true goods are willed but pleasure is sought, and not being truthful in and through the body. The second manifestation of chastity, the second manifestation of the coming together of these four pillars, is that the chaste person manifests an ethos. For Pope John Paul II, ethos is an inner form of morality. He says it consists really of an ethical perspective that derives from the inner perception of values. In this way, then, ethos gives moral parameters to the process of self-movement and self-determination with regard to perceived values. In the sexual domain, then, ethos includes, he says, both laws of conscience and a sensibility of the heart. In the context of chastity, it gives the chaste person parameters for sexual responsiveness and parameters for choices on the basis of that sexual responsiveness. Essentially, what we're saying is that the chaste, what evokes interest and desire in the chaste person is different from what evokes interest and desire in the unchaste person. It's not just the difference is this or that, but this ethos of how the parameters of choice are defined. And essentially, again, the chaste person is limited in these parameters to what is true, good, and beautiful in sexuality. This is the ethos that the chaste person operates with. Again, it's a coming together of the first two pillars that I've outlined and leading to the second two, that the ethos leads to behavior that is procreative and unitive and truthful. The third manifestation then of chastity. Chastity manifests, according to Pope John Paul II, chastity manifests genuine emotion in sexual responsiveness. He describes this quite well throughout the text, but when we put it together, what we have in Pope John Paul II is a beautiful comparison of how you have arousal and emotion in sexual attraction. He contrasts then emotion with arousal and says what the chaste person has is emotion, a very deep emotion, not to the exclusion of arousal, but in a way that outpaces arousal. What he means by this, first, that arousal is a response to the bodily sexuality of another and it seeks to express itself in sensual or bodily ways, whereas emotion is a response to the other person as sexual and tends to manifestations of affection, not necessarily physical or sensual acts. The main point is that while arousal limits itself to a body-to-body response, emotion is a response of the heart to the person. And again, it simply is a matter of the first two pillars coming together and leading to the second two pillars of chastity that I outlined. You have then, for the chaste person, sexual activity which contains both, or develops along the lines of both arousal and emotion, but in a way that creates what Pope II calls equilibrium between them. I think this is the vision of chastity that we can see in Theology of the Body. Certainly there are other ways of presenting it, but I think that is what we have as chastity. The first thing to note then is it is an entirely positive notion. It is not at all a not do this or this not this. It's every step of the way of the presentation was it is to have something. It is to do something. It is to be something. And that's the overwhelming message we ought to take away from the catechesis. If we look honestly at this vision of chastity, though, we can see that essentially the Holy Father is holding up the original state of man as the norm for our behavior. And he admits this quite readily. I am asking you to try to live, or Jesus Christ himself in the gospel is asking you to try to live according to God's original design. He then, of course, as you know from the catechesis, explains the difficulty we will have with that through concupiscence. So if we think about it in this way, where does all of this come from? These four pillars, these three manifestations, how can we have them? We are going to have to strive to live according to that original design of God. As with all of the other virtues, Pope John Paul II says we will have to dispose ourselves to this chastity. We will have to be committed to it. We will have to have an asceticism. This is dedication to controlling the passions. And yet the fullness of chastity will come only as a gift of grace. That no matter how much we dispose ourselves to it, we cannot overcome the sin that is going to hinder us from living this notion of chastity. Only Christ then can give us chastity. And Father Paul Quay, in his book, The Human Meaning of Sexuality, if you're familiar with that, has a beautiful line. He simply says, Christ is the source of your chastity. And this is what Pope John Paul II is saying as well. And this, it's important maybe perhaps to say, this should lead to chastity being an evangelization. If Christ is the source of your chastity and you're chaste, people will say, wow, you're different. Where did you get that? And you can say, Christ's, right? And this will lead to proper discussion. If that is true, though, as well, we will see that it's going to be difficult to be chaste in this way. We are trying to live according to our original state, and we only have fallen nature. But there is, again, this great confidence that Pope John Paul II engenders in us. To see if this is what Christ is asking of you, this is also what he's trying to give you. And we have to take that message to heart as well. Not just how difficult it will be, but how foolish we would be to pass up on this gift that Christ is trying to give us. We can't dispose ourselves to it. We have to receive the gift of grace. But I think we also have to say that chastity in this way comes from what Pope John Paul II calls the power of love. And put it simply, many of my students say, wow, that sounds great what you've outlined, but how in the world are we going to do that in our relationships? And in the abstract, it sounds a little bit difficult and complicated. But when you love the other person, you are brought to this discovery of the body, this discovery of all of the values, and you find the freedom that you need to be chaste. And the power of love really then is going to be the key to success. I will end on this point then. If we ask ourselves, what is really being asked of us in this vision of chastity presented by Theology of the Body? That notion of love, I think, is key. What you're being asked is to love. Right? When you're asked to be chaste by Christ, when you're asked to be chaste by the teachings of the Church, you're being asked to love. Again, it's not a negative meaning. It's you're asked to do something. But what hopefully I've encouraged you to see is that the vision of chastity is asking us to love sexuality the way God has created it. Love sexuality to the point, as all lovers do, of taking no substitute for your beloved. Not taking any partial versions of sexuality or altered versions of sexuality, but only wanting the real and true, valid form of sexuality, the way God has designed it. And this then really must be the final sort of overarching hallmark of the chaste person. He loves sex so much he will take no substitutes. He loves sex so much and says yes to real sex so much that he's able easily to say no to everything else. I am saying then that part of chastity, if we go back to the title of my paper, it's not enough to love the other. That's an important part of the relationship. But chastity comes precisely from loving sexuality, the way God has designed it, sexuality in yourself and sexuality in the other. It is in that way ironic that you have the Pope encouraging us to have sex and real sex, when our culture, on the other hand, is telling you, you don't really need the real thing. We'll give you a substitute. We lived in a time where the main advocate for sex in its real form was a Polish Pope in Rome. Thank you.